For joining us here on News Center. So much confusion on the reopening of schools. Some parents are actually welcoming the move, while others are concerned about the safety of their children. Others have gone ahead to say that we are using children as guinea pigs. What are your thoughts about this?
Thanks, Ashley, and plus the entire the KTN team for having me this morning. First, the closure of school was not based on scientific evidence and the data on how COVID transmission affects children or the contribution of children towards the spread of COVID. Secondly, is that up to today, there has not emerged a clear data on the relative contribution of children towards the spread of the COVID. And then finally is that when the studies that has been done in China, Italy, US, and Britain has shown that children only play a very minimal role in the spread of COVID. Actually, less than between 2 to 3% in the overall spread of COVID. And therefore, up to today, there is no scientific evidence that closure of schools in one way or the other contribute toward the spread of COVID or the overall death within the community. So it's important for clarity on that. Secondly is that I strongly support government decision to open schools. It is key, it is important, it is everything because a continuous closure of schools has a number of effects. One, we expect that significantly, and when you look at the countries that has already partially or fully opened schools, more than a third of the kids have not returned to school. Secondly, it is going to have a massive effect on the long-term life of children. Remember, a school to a child is not just about learning how to read, write, and and do mathematics. It contributes to the entire welfare of a child, the growth, the safety, the nutrition, because most schools children get food from school, many of them. And even more, it makes sure that children are safe from exploitation, violence, early pregnancies, and overall the entire of those negative effects. So if we keep schools closed, we are going to have a massive effect on not just the reversal of gains on education alone, but in the entire worldwide effect to the child.
As you've mentioned, schools, it's not about just learning, it's all about the interaction. And this is what parents are actually scared about. We've seen a number of countries reopen schools and then close them after a few weeks because of the COVID-19 cases that entered in the school. So then how do we stop this from occurring in the country?
Actually, when you look at it overall, and I'll give a practical example. South Africa is the country with the highest case load in Africa. As of yesterday, it had 650,000 case load. Nigeria, Senegal are among other countries. Morocco, Egypt are the top leading countries in Africa. And when you look at those countries have either fully opened their schools or partially. Actually, many of them started opening schools way back towards the end of June, early July. And in the cases where there has never been any strong outbreak of COVID in schools, actually. And in a situation like an example in Ghana, out of about 100 schools that opened, you will find that there were only about 14 schools where cases were reported, and there were less than 100 cases. And those cases were easily manageable. What those countries have done is they started preparing how to open schools way back. Actually, they took 2 to 3 months in terms of putting in place measures on how to open schools. Some began in April, others in May. And by June, July, they were already set to start reopening schools gradually. Some has fully opened, actually. This week, we have just seen Zambia opening fully all its schools. So what we need to ask ourselves is, what specific measures do we need to have in place in schools? There are a number of areas that I think we need to focus on. One is that there are kids who, like by and large, there are things that are in school. So we need to ask ourselves, what measures are we taking to make sure that the entire environment in which the children report back to school are properly taken care of to guarantee the safety and the welfare of a child. So things like masks, and we need to ask ourselves, do we need to have all the kids back to school at a go, or do we want to stagger them? And how do we want to go about that? I think that's something we'll get today clarity around that. And two, we need to ask ourselves, most of the kids actually use transport to go home. So we need to ask ourselves, how do we guarantee the safety of kids moving from home back to school and then back home? What measures do we need to keep in place? And then finally, is to ask ourselves, how do we keep monitoring the condition of kids? We need to put in place a proper system, random testing, masks, how do we manage kids and handling masks? We need to hand washing, making sure that there are clean water running throughout, kids continuously are washing and keeping clean, and the hygiene of the overall school. So those are some of the areas that we need to really focus on. It is also important, and I think this is something that has worried me a bit. Health is a devolved function. I've not seen how the Ministry of Health, the county government health departments, and the Ministry of Education are working together to make sure that they are put in place measures that create facility closer to school or within the school, where should a case be identified, it is very easy to handle those kind of cases. So nobody should create fear. And I have seen people say, bars are closed, but schools are open. For your information and to every parent out there, in all the countries where both Africa and even in the world, where schools have actually opened, bars are still closed. So Kenya is not unique in one way or the other. And finally, it is important to note this, and I really want to congratulate Senate. Senate actually provided a detailed report, the Education Committee of the Senate, that actually supported the opening of schools in September. And they gave very clear measures that needed to be put in place to be able to make sure that schools are able to open safely.
All right, you've talked about the issue of masks and monitoring these students. Before we even get to that, there's one major regulation, which is the social distancing one. We've seen schools that lack proper infrastructure, desks. We have seen children that share desks. We've seen classes that have more than 50 students in them. Then what happens to that?
There are two things to that. We need to ask ourselves, what are the temporary measures are we putting in place to make sure that we are able to observe social distancing in school? For instance, if you are going to open schools either in phases or at a go, all of the same, we need to ask ourselves, do we have sufficient infrastructure for that? My answer is no. So what can we do? When you go back to the Senate report, the Senate report gave a very good recommendation. For instance, we needed to mobilize more resources. We needed to mobilize the government, different departments to help schools come up with the temporary classes and to make sure that there are enough desks, quality, and all that, so that takes care of immediate needs to start gradual opening of the schools. However, we need to have a concrete long-term plan on massive investment in transforming the schools that we have. So we need immediate measures that are temporary in nature, but also we need to have a long-term measures around how do we transform our schools. So right now, my main concern is it is not more about desks. It is even trying to come up with even, for instance, why have we never thought about using Kasi Mutani and a lot of money to put up prefab classes that are temporary in nature, but they help us to resolve that issue. Within a month, within 3 weeks, we should have all those classes ready and we are able to move on.
What about the issue of school fees? We've seen parents come out saying, one of all, they haven't gotten the fee structure. We've seen so many parents and so many people in Kenya that are unemployed right now. So then how do they afford to take the kids or their children back to school?
This narrows down to how to meet the costs for children in schools. And our proposal, and we started giving these proposals way back actually in April. We gave a proposal to the government and we said, at the moment of COVID, this situation of COVID, it should have changed the entire government priorities and the budgeting process. And I have seen members of parliament making all manner of noise rather than providing solid answers. What do they need to do? First, we need to look at the budget. Do we still need to have all those manner of budget things you are putting in the budget, or do we need to prioritize the budget for critical things? For instance, we can afford to prioritize a lot of things in the budget. We have had a lot of savings that we have had. Why don't we transfer a lot of that money so that we take care of the costs in schools so that we create an elevation of a certain percentage cost to the parent. You can be able to take care of almost 72. In fact, if you look at the government across the world, what they are doing is they are reprioritizing their money and their budget and supporting critical sectors, education and health. And they are providing almost 70 to 80% of the total budget cost. So that helps to alleviate and help to bridge the gap between the loss of jobs and livelihood and ensuring that there is a continuity in terms of these critical sectors like health and education. So therefore, my recommendation is this. We should be able to have a government reprioritizing and providing a supplementary budget to the sector of education to mitigate those costs that schools need to sustain keeping the children in school.
All right. Thank you very much, Nungu Wanaina, who is the Executive Director, International Center of Policy and Conflict, for your insights. This comes as teachers were directed to report to schools on Monday as